It's made with grain. Basically, you take a grain, you kind of mush it up, put a little bit of water in it, and then it'll start to naturally ferment. And then there you have beer. It's another simple process, but with beer, there's a couple more ingredients. Like the German law for beer was it could only have 4 ingredients, which was water, hops, a grain, and then I forget, and then yeast, obviously the 4th one. A couple of other places make beer a little bit differently, but that's kind of the main basis of it. You also have like sake, which is made from rice. They call it kind of like rice wine. And then there was also pulque, which is made from agave. So that kind of covers fermented beverages, and that just covers it a little bit because now we have to go on to distilled beverages. In distillation, you basically take a fermented beverage, you make it get really hot and it starts to evaporate. The premise is that alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than the rest of the liquid, so you're able to basically evaporate off some of the water and some of the alcohol, and then it goes up this big tube. They then cool it down, and then it pops out the other side and starts dripping, and that is just more of like a pure alcohol or a more concentrated alcohol. So with distillation, you're able to get a much higher alcohol by volume content. So I'm going to use the example of wine. It's already fermented. It's at about 12-13%. So let's say you took this, you cooked it in a still, you evaporated the alcohol, and then you distilled it and turned it into a distilled spirit. You would get what is known as a brandy. The word brandy means a distilled beverage from wine. A wine is technically anything that is made with pears, apples, and things like that. You have pear brandy or apple jack or apple brandy. Now, a very specific example is pisco. So pisco is a brandy that is made in Peru and also sometimes Chile, depending on who you ask. But it's essentially this direct correlation. So you have a wine that's made from grapes. It is distilled. It then becomes a pisco. Pisco is very fascinating because it can only be made with 5 different types of grapes, and it has to come out at this very specific ABV because it can only be distilled once. A lot of spirits can be distilled many times. I do have a whole video on what pisco is if you want to learn more about that, but let's move along to other spirits. And just a fun little aside about the word spirits, it has a really funny origin, is that when people started drinking distilled beverages, basically people got really drunk and started acting crazy. And so they thought, oh, there's no way that they're drunk. They didn't really know what that was. They were just like, oh my God, they're possessed. So let's call all of these things spirits, which is great. I find that very funny. So back to our beer example. If beer is basically fermented grain juice, then whiskey is kind of like the next evolution of that, or the distilled version of that. And another fun thing, another little aside about this, I love fermentation. All right, I get very excited about it. Fermentation isn't just in liquid things. If you've ever made bread or any type of dough, that is fermented. So that is actually making alcohol, but then when you cook it, you're basically evaporating all the alcohol out. So what I'm trying to say is that whiskey is liquid bread. Whiskey is any spirit that is distilled from a grain alcohol source. In the case of bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. In the case of rye, it has to be at least 51% rye. But then in the case of like Scotch, it can be made with malted barley, more normally known as malt. So basically anything that comes from a grain. So anything that you can make a bread out of, you can make a whiskey out of. So if whiskey is made out of grain, then what about rum? Well, rum is super fascinating. Rum is anything that comes from the basis of sugar cane. The process is you take sugar cane, you squeeze it, you take the juice, and you spin it around really fast and get it really hot, and then it separates and becomes a crystallized sugar. And then you're left over with molasses. So you have 2 things that happen when you make sugar. You have actual sugar and molasses. Rum, as we know it, was actually distilled from fermented molasses. So during the big sugarcane push in like the early 1700s, sugarcane was brought from Asia. They planted it in South and Latin America and throughout the Caribbean, and it grew like crazy. It then became a huge push for the sugar trade, which was one of the biggest contributors to the slave trade. Another fun fact. But in the Caribbean, they would make a ton of sugar and they'd have these big vats of molasses. And that molasses would sit in the hot sun all day and it would ferment. The slaves would start drinking this fermented molasses to get them drunk. And then the people who owned the plantations were like, if they're enjoying that, maybe we can distill that. And that's kind of where rum comes from. We also have what is called rum agricole, which is how the French in the Caribbean started making their rum, as well as cachaça, which is Brazilian rum. Now, these two all come from freshly pressed sugarcane juice, which is high in sugar, obviously. And so that just naturally ferments and you get a funkier, more like grassy vegetal flavor than say like a traditional rum made from molasses. But then you also have something really fascinating like Mexican charanda, or at least in the example of Uruapan, they make this rum with a mixture of 50% molasses-based rum and a 50% fresh sugarcane rum, and they create charanda, which is a specific Mexican type of rum. The thing that's very fascinating about rum is that there's a lot of different variations based on where the rum is made, because all of this stuff is